Askreddit by LD Bulgar. What is the most jaw-dropping coincidence that you've ever witnessed or experienced? I was once mugged by 4 guys on one of the main shopping streets of Nairobi, Kenya. One of the guys had me in a chokehold, and just before I was about to pass out, they dropped me and ran. At the time I didn't know why. 12 months later, sitting on a beach on an island in Thailand, I meet a British couple who did business in Kenya, and we start to talk about how dangerous it was getting for foreigners. They described an incident the year before of turning a corner and seeing a white guy being mugged, and a shopkeeper rescued him by hitting one of them over the head with a bat. They were in the same street, on the same day, at the exact same time I was there. It was me who they witnessed being mugged. What are the odds of randomly meeting up on a beach in Thailand a year later? Please tell me you said something to them. Wife and I went out for lunch. Later that night we go out for dinner to a different part of town, a different restaurant, and we have the same waiter. All 3 of us started laughing when he walked over. I applied for a position as a 911 operator with the local sheriff's department. Part of the hiring process was an oral interview with 4 SD employees. I didn't make it on that round, but the testing for the next attempt was only a few weeks later, and I passed, and got invited in for the oral interview again, about 2 months after the previous one. I walk in, and it's the same 4 people. I sat down and said, "So, as I was saying." Got a big laugh. My sister bought me a book with my name in the title after spotting it at a charity shop. She didn't really look at it, just bought it. I started reading it and quickly realized the girl with my name was basically me. Same hair color, eye color, height and figure, even lived in the exact same area as me. She has a pretty hard time in the book, so hopefully that's where the resemblance stops. That's kinda cool, but also a bit creepy. Hope you're doing well. Visiting my aunt and uncle many years ago. They bought an enormous puzzle of the US. I don't know the number of pieces, but it was in a cardboard tube 12-18 inches or so high, and the pieces were small. My uncle picked a piece off the top. It showed the town we were in, where he was born and grew up. I picked up a piece off the top. It showed the city where my aunt and I were born and grew up, about 800 miles away. Wow. Went to a fancy restaurant with my new girlfriend for her birthday. Turns out the waiter's first name was my first name, and his last name was my girlfriend's first name. Was this Cheesecake Factory? I was watching Pointless, a show here in the UK where the most obscure answers to a question get the most points. Final round for the prize money. Contestants given 3 categories to choose from. One is best-selling authors, and I say to me friend, well, I'd only get answers if they chose authors, and it's Bill Bryson. They chose authors. It was Bill Bryson. I did get nothing but the best answers possible. And X200B. Not that exciting, but the one that always comes to mind first. I have an extremely unique name, and I'm fairly tall. The first and only time I met someone else with my name was a guy in high school who had the locker above me, and he was very short. We switched lockers. I used to live in America, live in England now. We were visiting family in England when I was 7, about 4 years before we actually moved over to the UK. They live in the same town my folks do now, and the fair was in town. My mum got a picture of my dad and I on the bumper cars. Years later, I found the picture, and in the bumper car next to me was a girl who I ended up being close friends with about 6 or 7 years later when we moved over. Another weird coincidence. I went to university in the UK, and befriended a girl who was friends with my best friend from when I lived in America. 2 completely different countries, and they happened to have met on an international language course. It's an odd coincidence. The people buried in the cemetery plot adjacent to my grandparents' plot have exactly the same names on their monument, including middle initials. They're not related and never knew each other during their lives. The only way a visitor can distinguish one grave from another is to know their exact dates of death, as everything else is identical, even the style of the monuments. The gravestone does not have date in the format like the 31st of March, 1950, the 31st of March, 2022. A few years back I got a new boss at work. He was about a year or two younger than me and had moved from out of state to take the job. We got to talking and found out that we both came from Queens, NY originally, but had moved out of the area as kids. We got to talking about Queens, and discovered we were from the same neighborhood. Then we realized we went to the same elementary school. He was a grade below me. We both moved after 4th grade, a year apart, and had the same teacher in 1st, 3rd and 4th grades. I moved out to the other side of my country for med school, and there I met the guy who would later become my best friend. When our families met we found out we were blood relatives. Our grandparents were cousins. That strengthened the bond. I made a friend when I was 15 and turned out that he used to live less than 1 kilometer away from me. There was just some woods between us. One time he came to our place and we took my dog for a walk and he showed me the place. A year or so later I had my tonsils removed, and as I was recovering there were a couple of men in the same room as me. I started a conversation with one middle-aged guy and he told me where he lived quite close to my home. This was a primary hospital for about 500k people, so a coincidence, since my home was in a rural area. Went on to ask him which house, and as he described it sounded familiar. Turns out he bought the house from my friend's family. I once shouted at a guy waking down the sidewalk at night to watch out for the 600-pound cow moose that was trotting down the sidewalk behind him in suburban Maine. He turned around to look at me and the moose walked right in front of him. I then saw the white cane in his hand with a green light on top. He was blind and thought I was messing with him. Probably the craziest coincidence I've ever experienced personally. Ran into a guy after joking about the fact my neighborhood had so many Daves and said, when will we get something new like Bob? The guy deadass looked at me and said, my name's Bob. Had him show his ID to prove it and there it was. Thanks Robert. I knew a cop through my work that was obsessed with writing tickets for equipment violations, especially improper license plate displays. He once told me he wrote a guy 4 tickets in 4 days for having a custom tailgate that displayed the plate at an angle not that easy to change. One day a bunch of us were riding motorcycles and stopped for fuel, and I noticed one bike had their plate mounted vertically. I told her I know an arsehole cop that would love to cite you for that. 10 seconds later, that very cop rode up on his own motorcycle, off duty. We were 75 miles away. Man. My wife and I went to a park one time when one of our friends let us know a group would be playing volleyball there. We didn't know anyone but the friend that invited us. One dude there was one of those over-the-top competitive types despite everyone else playing for fun recreation. The next day, we're at dinner about 10 miles away with a completely different friend. We're sitting on the restaurant's patio, chatting. Told a story about this douche at volleyball the day before. And then my wife goes, holy shit, that's him. The dude was walking past the restaurant at the exact moment we were talking about him. Hadn't ever seen the dude before volleyball and haven't seen him once since the unrelated dinner. Was doing a study abroad in Italy and some roommates who I hated went out to party, and on their way back to the apartment a random man jumped out and peed on them. A week later me and my roommates, that I liked, were in line at a train station and were talking about the pee incident. Then an American guy who was a student in a different program and was standing behind us in line heard what we were saying and told us that he had some friends who got peed on too. Then from the back of the line another American student from a different program said that her roommates had peed onto by some guy. It turned out that these students were staying kind of near our area. So I guess there was one guy running around Rome specifically peeing on American students. Oh boy, was he just marking his territory? In a very remote part of Death Valley Warm Springs Canyon near where the Death Valley Germans disappeared, I stopped and chatted with one of the 5 people I saw in the area the entire long weekend. He commented about my t-shirt for the shop I worked at. Turns out he lived a few blocks from the shop and passed by it daily, hundreds of miles away in a minor suburb of the Los Angeles sprawl. My 4th grade teacher decides she was going to join the Peace Corps and start teaching out in the world. She visited us in 6th grade when she was between assignments. Tells me she will see me out in the world. First time I went offshore for a job, out in Petling Street, Kuala Lumpur. I see this blonde crinkly hair in the crowd with backpack. Tap her on the shoulder and it's my 4th grade teacher. Totally met her out in the world. How brilliant. That sounds like a wonderful plot for a coming of age film. Lost a front wheel on the highway. Pulled over and stopped near the overpass guardrail. Look back to see what carnage I surely had caused. To my relief, none. However, my front wheel comes rolling down the shoulder, bounces off the guardrail and falls into the empty wheel well. No way.